Okay, so let's talk about the deal with Pandora and what does her story seem to imply or talk about here? And maybe you've got some thoughts already on that. Um, but first thing we might notice is that in some versions of the story, anyway, this is the origin of women. And so women are created as a gift for men, but a tricky gift that's really bad for them and leads to literally all the suffering in the world. Okay. You can tell that the first thing we notice is that this shows a very negative view of women, right? That women are bad and they cause men suffering, and they're tricky, which says a lot about the gender roles and relationship between genders in ancient Greece, and it says a lot about Hesiod too, or Hesiod, however you want to say it. What you'll notice is that he is very down on women throughout his writings. And we wonder, how much is that specific to him? How much of that is part of the culture and part of the mythology? Because again, we have his specific version, if he's a real person. I guess we could also say that tradition's specific viewpoint. So we notice that. But what else do we notice? Well, to figure out more about Pandora and how she fits into all this, we might have to look at the rest of Hesiod's Works and Days story. Because there's basically two really big stories in Hesiod's Works and Days poem. One of them is sort of Pandora and Prometheus, all of that goes down, but the other is about the Golden Age. And so let's take a look at the Golden Age and then come back to Pandora. So, the myth of the Golden Age. This myth is also known as the Ages of Man, because of course it is, because Hesiod is biased. But the story goes, and notice that this is actually pretty different from what we were previously looking at. They couldn't both happen at once, but that's okay, because in Greek mythology and in many mythologies, it's okay if the stories conflict. You just work it out. But here's how the story goes when you look at the story of the ages of man. Once there was a golden age, and this was literally the age of gold. That gold was somehow the symbol for this time period. And the men who lived in this time, they never grew old and they never suffered. They lived these perfectly happy lives. And interestingly, they did not have to farm. Hesiod says that they just got food from the land. They plucked the food off the trees, and it make them, they lived these wonderful, happy lives, and they were very good. They were good kind of people, and they were very kind and merciful, but they were also strong and beautiful. And the gods hung out with them all the time. They were very close to the gods in a way that modern human beings are not close to the gods. So the Golden Age was the best time to be alive. And then for some reason, Zeus decided to wipe him out and start over. Okay, we can't really know why Zeus wanted to do that, but he did that. So then we had the Silver Age. And the Silver Age was almost as good as the Golden Age, but not quite. The Silver Age, the men of that generation, or really existence time period, the people there were children for a really long time. And then finally, after 100 years, they became adults. So they lived these really long lives, but it wasn't quite as perfect as the Golden Age men who just had everything worked out for them. The Golden Age men, I should mention, could die, but they would just die perfectly and peacefully in their sleep. And the Silver Age men, they have a little bit more suffering. Their growth is kind of weird and strange. And they offended the gods. They kind of irritated them at some points because they were strong and they were sort of more rivals to the gods than the Golden Age people were. So Zeus wiped them out. And then we have the Bronze Age. And the Bronze Age men were very strong. They were sort of brutally strong. They were kind of wicked and tyrannical. They were rough and dangerous, and they were very much all about being warriors. And they were great warriors. They were beautiful and strong and noble, but they were also kind of cruel, and they didn't eat bread. They still didn't have to work very hard for their food, but they went against the gods. They tried to fight the gods, so Zeus wiped them out. And then the next one is the Age of Heroes. Now this is a little bit weirder. We kind of get to the story of the Trojan War in this in a way. because part of the story of the Trojan War is that there was this time when there were all these great heroes running around on the earth, that these were the ancestors of the modern Greeks, but everything had gone downhill from there. So these were people who were larger than life. They were still mostly recognizable as human, but they were greater and they could do things modern humans couldn't do. There's stories in the Iliad of guys who could like lift up a giant boulder with one hand, or split it in half, or kill somebody just by grabbing them with their hand. Things like that. These are the kind of heroes that we're talking about. And so these are the great warriors, and they get a happily ever after because the gods take them to a place known as the Blessed Isles, which is another one of the sort of good afterlives of Greek mythology. You only go there if you're a great and wonderful warrior hero. But the age of heroes is over because the Trojan War, this is the part of the story, is again a way of Zeus wiping the slate clean and starting over. So the age of heroes came to an end, and then finally we ended up in the age of iron. So the age of iron is Hesiod's modern age. And what does Hesiod have to say about his own time period? This is the age where people must work all day and suffer. They must labor and labor. They must struggle to get food from the ground. They have to farm. They have to farm really hard and work really hard. And, if you actually look at ancient farming before modern technology, it's no picnic. You're close to starving most of the time. And that's what Hesiod is talking about. And so some people who think that Hesiod is a real person say that he was definitely a farmer, because he's definitely expressing a farmer's complaint that you have to work all day and suffer a lot. And so the modern age, the Iron Age men must get their food by farming, where the Golden Age men could just pluck food off the trees. Now, there's a couple of interesting things going on here. One is that, in a certain sense, this is historically accurate, in that there was a time period in early human civilization where everybody was what's known as hunter-gatherers. They would gather their food from the environment. Sometimes they would hunt animals. Often they would just eat fruit from the trees or bark or stems or things like that. And they didn't really need to work too hard for food. But once people invented farming, which is sort of a more stable existence, allows you to plan for the long term a lot better, then the farmers were kind of locked into this existence where they struggled and they had to work for their food. So that is really true in a certain sense. It wasn't necessarily the will of Zeus, unless you want to believe that, but yes, it's something true, and maybe people are remembering an earlier time period. It's also true that the hunter-gatherers never really went away, so you could notice that there were people who were doing that sort of thing. But weirdly, they were thought of as barbarians instead of golden, wonderful people who were friends with the gods. It's also true that there was a movement from a Bronze Age to an Iron Age, because during the time period of the really, really ancient Greeks that the Trojan War stuff is kind of modeled after, they used tools made out of bronze. They hadn't figured out how to make iron or smelt iron into workable form yet, make iron tools. And in Hesiod's time, they do have iron. But iron is less beautiful, so he uses it as a symbol of how much life sucks, is that they may have better tools, but their lives are worse. And you can definitely see in this progression from things were great and then they got worse. And whenever people talk about a golden age, they're usually saying something along the same lines. There have been so many people throughout history who've said, things used to be great back in the golden age, but things got worse and worse, and now we live in a crappy age. They don't necessarily go through all the steps, but the golden age versus the iron age, that's a powerful thing. And so let's think about the Hesiod the farmer. What are the things that Hesiod or whatever farmers' stories kind of gave rise to this poetic tradition? What does Hesiod hate? He hates women and he hates farming. That seems pretty clear from the story. And so what are there any ways we can tie these concepts together? I think we actually can. Because what do we say about these golden age men? Well, they never grow old. They don't grow old, and when they die, it's after a really, really, really long life. Whereas in Hesiod's time, you die very quickly by comparison. And if life is short, how do you ensure that there's another generation to go farm your stupid farm? Well, you have children. And who's associated with fertility, with this power to have children? Who's seen as having this power of birth? Well, in ancient Greek society, that's associated with goddesses and it's associated with women. So maybe now we can put some puzzle pieces together here and notice that Hesiod includes the story of Pandora and the story of the Golden Age in the same story. Now, he doesn't necessarily come right out and say anything, but let's think about what was life like before Pandora, before the first woman? Well, we didn't have sickness and death and labor and toil and struggle. And these are all things that we have in the Iron Age, but not in the Golden Age. So we didn't have women who are seen as the reason we have to keep having children, and we didn't have these struggles and suffering. And Pandora is for both. Well, it's not really her fault. She's the first woman. She can't really help that. And honestly, it doesn't seem like she can really help opening the jar either. She's too curious. But the first woman causes men this suffering. Now, did everyone in Greece necessarily believe in Hesiod's exact story? No, like I said, there's multiple ways to go about things, ways to interpret things, and different versions of the stories. But it certainly is interesting that these two things come up in the same story. In a way, it's almost like he's saying, because there are women who have the power to give birth, we have to have children. We have to have the next generation. And think back on Gaia, who's linked to, these different generations of children who are going to challenge their fathers and cause even more trouble for the men. It sort of implies a lot about the way this is all seen. In Hesiod's ideal world, you wouldn't have to have women. You could just be men who lived for almost forever and never suffered, and you wouldn't have to farm. So there's a lot that's going on there. And I think it's pretty important that those things are linked together in the same story. And honestly, the rest of the Works and Days is about farming. It's about when to plant your crops. So it's a poem about when to farm, and also how much it stinks that we have to farm. It's all Pandora's fault. At least that's the way Hesiod is thinking about it. So you can see all the sort of links here to these different cultural things, these values, the way that a particular group of people sees the world. And in some ways we find the story very resonant in terms of, it's interesting to think about an origin of suffering in the world. But also, you've got the very strong ancient values that are coming through here. It may remind you of some other stories, like is it bringing back the story of Adam and Eve, where this woman is responsible, the first woman is responsible for the way things are. She's responsible for, in fact, we're going to get into this when we look at the Bible story of Genesis. She is responsible, in theory, the fact that men have to farm the land and they can't just eat the food in the Garden of Eden. So that's pretty interesting too. And there's another tradition in Japan of Izanami and Izanagi, the first man and the first woman, and we'll look at that if we get the chance. Hopefully we will. She speaks first, and that kind of puts a curse down upon them, which sucks that that's how the story goes, but it puts a curse upon them. And when he speaks first, everything is right. So these gender roles work their way into these stories. And it's interesting to have the woman blamed for evil. But what is the goddess, the woman, really all about in these stories? Well, she's all about life. So she's bringing life into the world. So I don't know, maybe it's not her fault that life is full of suffering. She's just the one who gets blamed for creating life. The last thing I want to say about the Golden Age story is that there's a story very similar to it in the Bible as well. Well, similar in a way. This king called Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and the prophet Daniel interprets it. And the king dreams of this statue that's made of different pieces, and it's got gold, iron, bronze, and finally clay. And rock comes along and crushes it. And this is seen as a prophecy of the future, of the different kingdoms that are going to happen. The king lives in a golden age, but then there's going to come inferior ages that are worse. And people have tried to map these to historical kingdoms. But I think it's most interesting in suggesting maybe the Jewish people were influenced by the same myths as the Greeks. Okay, that's all we have time for now. But I will see you guys in the discussion section to see what you guys make of all this. So see you with the discussion questions. All right, catch you later.